This webinar holds every first, every fourth Tuesday of the month. The fourth Tuesday of the month is when we hold this webinar. My name is David Brown. I'm MUA Extension Small Ruminant Specialist. And once again, thank you for joining us today. Before we go straight to that, a few things to know before we proceed today. This webinar is being recorded, and the presentation along with the link will be sent to all participants at the end of this webinar today. Please kindly type your questions like we do always in the chat box. We'll endeavor to answer the questions today. And if you cannot answer the questions, we'll, of course, reach out back to you with your answers. Today, we're going to also put a link on the chat to the evaluation survey. May you please help us fill up the link so that we can serve you better. We are going to also send that link to you when we send the materials to everyone today. Please can help us click on the link and tell us how we're doing, and now we can all serve you better. Thank you so much. Today we have two presenters today, alongside with our MU Virtual Things Program Manager. They'll be doing all the talking today. And our first presenter today is Dr. Joel Yelich from the Scientific Affairs Rangeland Specialist. And of course, he works with vans. And the second presenter is Dr. James Brainer who is a livestock grazing specialist, South Dakota State University. And of course, like I said, we have Caitlin Dozler, MU Virtual Things Program Manager. They will all be doing talking today. I'm going to, without wasting time, ask Joel to please take the floor, take the stage as we talk on virtual fencing for grazing livestock. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. I think we are there. Okay, I think everybody should be able to see that.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much, David, for the opportunity to come and talk on your webinar today. And my name is Joel Yelich, and I work with Vince as a scientific affairs rangeland specialist, focusing on virtual fence in our particular company. So David's asked me to kind of talk a little bit today about what virtual fence is, how it works, and some of the different mechanisms before Jamie takes over and talks a little bit specifically about each specific virtual fencing type company, as well as use of virtual fence in ruminants or in small ruminants. So, what is virtual fence? They're pretty typical across the different platforms as far as what they do. Basically, their collars that are on the animals have a GPS tracking device in them. Those collars then have some type of audio or pulse electrical stimulus that helps to control movement of animals, particularly animals that are trained. And then that allows producers to contain animals, exclude animals, control their movement with virtual geospatial boundaries that are actually set up within the working system of a virtual fence system. And so, let's see here. So most virtual fence systems are pretty much set up similar in how they work. There's probably one exception, and that would be no fence. But in general, the three major ones work basically with having some type of animal tracking device on the animal. And this, in our case, we call this a cattle rider. This is the device that is on the animal, contains the GPS chip, and then also applies the stimulus. That collar itself then communicates back and forth. So it sends signals and receives signals from a base station. Those base stations are essentially light infrastructure of different sizes that enable to use virtual fence at remote locations where sometimes signals are hard to get. And then that base station communicates by cellular signal to some type of herd manager. Um, and that herd manager allows you to um, plan on virtual fences, monitor animals, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. Let's see here. This just gives kind of another view of the platform. And our platform at Vince is very similar to the other platforms, where we essentially have animals that are contained within virtual fences. So these lines dictate virtual fences. These animals are collared. Those collars basically get signals from a GPS satellite. That signal then is transmitted by what we call LoRaWAN signal radio frequency to a base station, and that base station then communicates with that cellular signal that goes to the cloud, where we basically have the operations for the network, and you have your herd manager app, which allows you to make changes um, to your virtual fence system and monitor and track animals, as I indicated before. So this is Vince's collar. The collars are fairly similar with other companies, but basically, each of these collars has some type of housing that contains the electrical units. And from this collar, the sound is emitted that goes to the animal. We have basically a small chain that comes up here that contains the pulse signal. It has a plastic bridge at the top that basically breaks the conductivity so that you get the signal that comes up both sides here. And then we have a plastic bridge at the top that serves as a safety mechanism that will break at a certain pound rate if that animal gets that collar set on something. And so this is what that collar looks like on an animal. And we have very good containment of these new collars, particularly with the new locking carabiners that we use on them. So that's essentially that collar weighs approximately 2.5 pounds. And so it's fairly light in respect to some of the other collars. So just to go over again what's in this particular collar, you have a radio chip which communicates with the base station on that LoRa signal. So that sends signals back and forth. You have the GPS receiver, which determines the animal position off of GPS satellites. Then the caller is going to deploy your sound signal and then also your pulse stimulus. Um, Ours is electrical pulse stimulus that's very similar to what you would get off of an electric fence. Some of the callers actually have some vibration stimuluses. The collars are have a memory in them, and so they're autonomous operation, meaning that you can download the virtual fence boundaries into the collar. So if the collar loses radio frequency contact with the base station, the basic virtual fences are still in the collars. And so if the animals come upon a virtual fence, or on those geospatial coordinates, you'll still get a sound and still get a shock, even if you're out of radio coverage. The radio coverage is primarily important when you're trying to send signals and then also monitor animals in real-time situations. Our particular collar contains a battery. Um, Some of the other collars actually contain a battery with a cell or with a solar panel on it. Upon intensive management, our batteries need to be changed out frequently, about every 3 or 4 months. Very extensive management, particularly on our large type places out west. We're talking 6 to 8, 9 months. And as we make improvements to that and get our newer collars online, these will be changed significantly on the capabilities of that. So basically, most of these collars work in the same type of scenario. The animals are collared. They move into the pressure zone of the virtual fence. That pressure zone typically is going to contain a sound barrier and then an electrical barrier. And so when they hit there, there is pressure to the animals, and most of these animals will be trained before they will go out on pasture to receive the sound signal And then if they go through the sound signal and don't respond to it, then they go into the electrical or pulse signal. And then most of the systems have a fail-safe mechanism that if they're in here and they start to get too many pulses, the system will actually shut off and reboot itself once the animal gets back into the inclusion zone. All of these systems are set up on a one-way gate scenario where the animal does not receive pressure when it's coming back through the gate from the opposite side. That way, you have what's called passive recapture that allows the animal to get back into the inclusion zone. This is a video here that's going to kind of show what this actually looks like real quickly. Um, you're going to see an animal here that is going to be approaching the sound zone. As it approaches it, it will touch into the sound zone. Here's the sound right there. And then that turns the animal away from the sound zone. And so I would say that probably about 90% of our animals are very well trained to the sound and shock zone. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here. So if you look at a regular base station, we talked about this. Most of them on the different production systems use what's called LoRa technology, which is a really high frequency technology that's very low energy use, has a cellular backhaul that then bridges that to the internet. Most of them have solar panels in here that operate the system. So that allows them to be able to be out in the field in remote situations. Um, and then we can deploy these in a lot of different topographical regions. And our particular system is designed to last more than 10 years. And we have really good coverage with these particular towers. So this part of the tower is the cellular antenna, and the one up at the top is the LoRa antenna. And our towers can reach anywhere up to about 10 to 12 kilometers from the location of the tower. And then there'll be differences between the different companies. A lot of our customers, particularly in the Western United States, have portable base stations. So this is an example of one of our base stations that's on a trailer, gets taken out to the site where we want to employ it. And in this particular one, you can see this mountain range back here. This particular tower will cover all the way to these mountains over here, and then about 10 kilometers down the valley. And so we get really good coverage from example from one single tower. And so it works really well. When we come on, we'll usually do an RF planning scenario. In this particular case, we want to determine how many base stations we will need and the coverage that we'll get. This is an example of a place in Colorado where these little orange dots indicate base stations. In this particular case, we had 5 base stations over coverage area of about 40,000 acres. And you can see that we get really, really good coverage across this whole grazing allotment, which assures that you'll have real-time coverage on probably about 90% of that allotment. And again, remember, even in these areas like this where we don't get coverage, we would have autonomous coverage, meaning that if you have virtual fences in here where you're holding animals to graze in a certain area, they'll still work without the radio coverage. And then finally, you have the herd manager software. There's different versions with the different companies, but this allows you to visualize your pastures, landmarks, build your virtual fences, track your animals, visualize where those animals move by heat maps. We'll go through that a little bit. Have your ear tags, caller IDs, and then monitor the health of your collars from that herd manager software. This is an example here of the different grazing pastures that are set up, animals that are located out there on the grazing pastures. And then on the right side over here is a heat map. And we'll talk a little bit about what heat maps show that are generated from the data that's collected from um, the collars and all the GPS points in them that give us an idea of movement and activity of cows or livestock that have virtual fence collars. This is an example of a heat map that was done in Colorado or in Idaho. The yellow lines are the actual virtual fences. These red areas are extra exclusion zones where we just wanted to make sure we didn't get any more animals to go, particularly over here, which is private property. And so this is an example of a whole entire virtual fence system with no physical fence on it. And we'll run it here real quick, and you'll be able to see the animals being trained over here, move out to the pasture, and then you'll be able to watch their locations across the pasture throughout a grazing system. This actually is in May. We're on 5/28, and it will show you what kind of movement you get, shows you where the water structures are at in this particular pasture. The red colors indicate high activity and of animals in that location, which would typically indicate you're probably going to have a little bit more grazing activity in those locations. And then you'll essentially see those animals will drift off as they go over to the next pasture. And they were kept in this pasture, for example, it's about a 3,000 acre pasture for about 30 days. And I think there were 100 and I think there are 160 animals in that particular pasture. So that gives you a good example of understanding where those animals move to, where they graze, how long they're in certain areas, and all that information is kept in the cloud on the virtual fence system. This is an example at Oklahoma State, um, looking at a 100-acre paddock that has physical fence on the outside and then as a water trough over here in the corner. So this is common water that serves for their wheel hub that they're going to make for virtual fencing. And so they build their virtual fences. This particular case, they have 28 acres that they're grazing over 7 days. We talk about the one-way fence. So if you get some animals that come over here, they can move their way back through the fence. Then they just reset the fence after 7 days to another 27 acres, allows them to, again, capture animals by passive capture if they went outside the fence. And then you've got your water trough down here in the corner where they will. And then they'll move that fence again. So now this is their third rotation, 7 days on 28 acres. And you'll notice the way that the white here indicates the sound zone, red shock zone. And so this is their inclusion zone. And you can see how animals move across it. And then finally, they'll do their fourth rotation. All this is being done from the computer and with no human movement. They're just using the behavior of the livestock to be able to move through that passive capture system. And then eventually what they'll do is they'll set up their new fence. They'll use passive capture as the cows move through to the water, and then it forces them to come back up to their brand new rotation on the fourth side. So that's a really good example of how you can use virtual fence to do really high intensive grazing using your herd manager software or whatever software you're using. Um, So let's talk a little bit now about the advantages and limitations of virtual fence and the different scenarios that you use it. We like to look at it from how we can work with producers that use virtual fence to help on their overall profitability when they use it. So the biggest thing that we see is a reduction in labor of moving cattle, particularly if you're in big grazing allotments, finding cattle throughout the year, and then the infrastructure of fence. A mile of fence nowadays is going to cost you anywhere from $8,000 to $30,000 a mile. And so that becomes a very limiting cost, particularly if you're using a lot of cross fences from that particular standpoint. And those would be permanent fences. So we're reducing the cost associated with labor and infrastructure. You're able to track your animals and manage your animals in near real time when
Mhm.
you have good coverage on all those animals. That's probably a big one that producers really like, which really helps them with their quality of life and understanding where those animals are at, and then how they can reduce their labor time when they're actually locating or moving animals. You have a better opportunity to manage your grazing, so you can increase your productivity. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we have some of our producers that are actually, because they're doing a better job of managing their grazing, they're actually able to increase their stocking density and have more animals in their pastures to graze. And then that helps to increase their profits. And some of those are actually using that to offset the cost of the virtual fence. Stewardship is another main program of our virtual fencing program, in that it does a couple different things. It allows you to graze where you want or where you may need to graze when you want or when you need to graze. And so you have a much more ability to manage your grazing or to do even more targeted grazing. For example, we have some people that are using it to target graze on things like cheatgrass, which has really helped. Um, you can then start to collect your grazing data, which then you can actually start to inform management decisions. Helps with the flexibility and adaptability of how you use those virtual fences across your grazing operations. And then the other thing is how we can protect sensitive areas and reduce impact to wildlife and fisheries. And here's a good example of a place in Colorado or in Idaho where we have a really large problem with elk damaging fences. And so this particular case over here, you can see where the black line indicates where they actually have a two-wire electrical fence in this allotment. And now with the use of virtual fence, excuse me, with the allowance of virtual fence, they're going to be able to take all of this electrical wire out. And now the elk aren't routinely tearing it up, safer for the wildlife. And there's basically no repair of fence needing to be done in this area here. And so that probably saves them at least a week's worth of work every year. Another good example is to be able to graze post wildfire. This is one on a U.S. Forest Service BLM allotment. There's another good example of Donnell Brown in Texas that used virtual fence to graze after wildfire that went through their ranch. And so that's another opportunity to be able to protect some of these areas that got burned. Challenges, limitations. Um, Certainly, you're going to have limited signal coverage in some environments. So that can be somewhat of a challenge, particularly even if you have those that operate with a LoRa signal, or some that operate just off cellular signal. Jamie, I think, is going to talk about no fence, which operates off a cellular signal. Um, Again, it's not 100% effective. I would say that most of our systems are in that 90 to 95% effective or containment. Um, Physical fence isn't 100% effective. So you're always going to have a few animals that are going to push the boundaries on that. You do have issues if you have any collar retainment issues or maybe a malfunctioning of collars. Those are limited, but those can be an issue for some people on how they deal with those, particularly if those animals are in larger grazing pastures or they don't have access to any facilities to change those collars out. You always have issues of learning the technology, which can be challenging for some people. Um, you also have what I call the increased accountability because you have to maintain how you work with those animals, but also being on the computer, paying attention what's happening with your animals and collar functionality and virtual fence functionality. And then cost is also probably one of the biggest challenges and current limitations. It's going to really um, enhance the need for partnerships. For example, NRCS now has equip funds that they're allowing for producers to use on purchasing virtual events You have a lot of conservation districts that are actually getting involved in purchasing these towers to be able to work over a wide range. Um, and then to give you the idea of the pricing structure, so I'm going to cover just our pricing structure, but in this particular case, our base stations are um, $12,500. If we assist with the install, or if you do a self-install, it's 10,000. Our callers are rated on a subscription basis, and that you basically are paying $40 a year to rent the collar, and then the batteries are $10. Most people are typically only using one battery per year. This would be a pretty average customer with two towers, 300 collars, 300 batteries per year. So you can see how that initial setup cost is pretty expensive. And we have a lot of our producers that are working with partnerships to be able to pay for those costs. The other place that you can go, I'll finish up with, is the Rangeland Gateway, which goes through different virtual fence systems. Um, and it will go through those, and we can share that later if we need to. Um, so, and then there's my name, contact information, and we'll have this in the PDF file as well as you can get it off the recording. Ty is one that handles most of the area north of Missouri, and then Eric is in Texas and he handles all of the southeastern United States. So there we go.
Thank
And
you so much, Dr. Yuel. We appreciate you.
yep,
There are three questions. We're going to take that at the end when Dr. Jamie finishes his web
yep.
presentation. Over to you, Dr. Jameson.
Okay, let's try that again. I'm on mute, and can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm just going to compliment Joel's kind of talk a little bit and maybe kind of give a little bit about practical considerations for virtual fence and maybe some of the lessons that we've learned, over the past 4 years of implementing this in South Dakota on rangelands here. Generally speaking, when I talk about virtual fence, I kind of lump it into this precision livestock management technology. And we're seeing a lot of these different technologies come online these days. And these are anything from in-pasture weighing scales to virtual fence systems to advanced remote sensing technology. It's really pretty amazing how many things are becoming available in this market space for livestock producers to be able to implement. And really, the overall goal of all of these is to improve animal efficiency, to improve range operations, reduce labor, and really optimize kind of these inputs into our livestock production systems. I kind of thought I'd just give a little bit of background on kind of advances in virtual fence. And really, we see a lot of stuff about virtual fence these days, but it's really not a new concept. Virtual fencing really began in the late 1990s to be able to manage livestock on the landscape. And really, when we think about this, and kind of the easiest analogy for producers to hang on to is really it's an invisible fence for dogs, only we're applying this to livestock, right? And so you have these virtual boundaries that animals interact with. They get an auditory and an electrical cue that goes alongside that to be able to manage where these animals are on the landscape. And a lot of this work kind of began with Dean Anderson, who was at the USDA ARS down at the Horonata Experimental Range in New Mexico. And you can see here on the left side is this image of really which is one of the first virtual fence collars that they developed from some of that pioneering work. And there are kind of these Frankenstein devices that they had on animals, and really just to kind of prove and test that concept of can cattle learn through stimuli to be able to manage on the landscape. And so from that early work from Dean Anderson, E. Shepard kind of began maybe one of the first commercial pioneers of implementing virtual fence systems in 2014. Vents came along later, which is really kind of maybe the first commercial option that we had in the United States, probably one of the most researched companies that we have out there as well. But really, it took about 20, 25 years for that initial concept of virtual fencing on livestock for that technology to become smaller, for that technology to become cheaper, so we could really start implementing these kind of solutions at scale. And it's pretty amazing to think how far we've come in about 20, 25 years for this technology, but also thinking that it's still new and novel as we were applying this at scale, and it's continually going to be improving over the next 5 or 10 years, I would imagine, from these different companies. Joel kind of talked about this a little bit. We know that fences dictate boundaries, especially in the Western United States, but really all across the United States. And 1 mile of fence is becoming increasingly expensive, right? And so we estimate about $15,000 to $20,000 for a mile of fence within South Dakota rangelands that we have here. If you have more mountainous terrain, we've heard estimates of 30,000 to 40,000 for a mile of fence that exists out there. So this is a pretty significant investment if you're putting physical fence on your property out there. And again, one of the top barriers to improving grazing management is things like capital, having funds to be able to implement new fencing on the landscape, having labor to be able to do that, and then that infrastructure, water and fence needs as well. And so there's a lot of producers that are really interested in implementing different grazing management scenarios or strategies, but maybe there's a lot of barriers to entry for doing that through capital, labor, and infrastructure as well. And so virtual fence might be a solution for a lot of these situations where you're trying to basically transform that manual labor of going out there, physically setting up fence, into cognitive labor, using our brains to kind of think about how are we going to manage that landscape more dynamically using some of these virtual fence tools out there. Joel kind of went over this. Most virtual fence systems basically function in the exact same way. You got a GPS-enabled collar, you have an auditory and electrical cue, and then you have some kind of real-time, tracking or data that's generated from these collars that you have here. And so just to kind of reiterate that, here's a virtual fence boundary at our Cottonwood Field Station located in western South Dakota. And these were yearling steers that had collars on them. And you can see where this virtual boundary is there, with that white being the auditory zone and that red being the electrical zone in there. And we found that generally speaking, when the technology is working properly, when the collars are on the animals like they're supposed to be, that it actually can be pretty effective at controlling animal movement on the landscape. Obviously, one of the biggest limiting factors within these systems is going to be your water, right? And so we have our water system here, similar to Oklahoma, where we tend to rotate animals around whatever our water source is in that pasture. And that allows a couple things. One, it allows that passive capture system to really work most effectively. So if these animals do break out and get outside of this area that we want them to, they're going to have to go back to water at some point in time, and they're essentially recaptured when they go back to that water source. And so it really helps to be able to plan your virtual rotations around where that water source is to kind of maximize the efficiency of these systems. That being said, you can't put a virtual boundary anywhere on the landscape. You still are going to be kind of constrained somewhat by where your water is, which is always going to be a limiting factor for grazing management. As Joel talked about, the general collar design is really the same across most of the companies. You have some kind of box that houses electronics within that unit. Some of them have solar power, some of them have battery power. You have this chain system that delivers the electrical stimuli on animals. And then you have some kind of bridge system here, which essentially acts as a fail-safe. And so if your animals are in pasture and maybe they get caught on a fence post or something like that, these systems are really designed to have a break point there. So if they pull away, that thing will break before that animal has any kind of harm come to them. And so it's important to understand those different safety features that are implemented within these different virtual fence companies, and kind of what they're designed for and what's that breaking proof, especially if you're going to implement these maybe on small ruminants, what might have a lower, breakaway threshold compared to, maybe a 1,400-pound cow, as you can imagine there. And so I want to kind of talk a little bit about virtual fencing technology and some of the different companies that are available in the market space right now. One is Halter, which is a company that's based out of New Zealand. Gallagher or East Shepherd, which originated in Australia. We have No Fence, which originated in Norway, and then Vents, which originated in the United States, in America. And so all of these companies, like I said, the underlying principle of them work basically the same. The collars are pretty similar across all of them, but there are some nuances in these different technologies that I think are important to consider, especially as producers are looking at different options and what might fit best for their operation if they do want to implement virtual fencing. And so No Fence is a company that, like I said, established in Norway in 2011. They make collars specifically designed for cattle as well as sheep and goats. And I know this is a small ruminant, I believe, webinar that's on here. To my knowledge, No Fence is the only company that makes sheep and goat collars. And so if you're interested in utilizing these for small ruminants, this is probably your best bet to be able to implement these things on animals. They do have a mobile app as well as a computer web interface that you can interact with the collars and the software that's in there. That mobile app can be really handy, especially if you're out in pasture and maybe you need to make adjustments or changes. You usually have your cell phone handy on you. It can be a little bit more challenging if you don't have that mobile app to be able to interact with some of these different softwares. So it's important to consider, what's your computer situation as you're implementing these, what works best for you. As Joel said, these work by cellular communication, and so they don't have base stations, and so that reduces some of the initial upfront cost associated with that. But that being said, you still have to purchase the collar, and so those collars can range from about $289 to $199, depending on which species you're utilizing it in, with a yearly subscription cost, which is basically your data fee for communicating that data via cell signal of about $42 to $56 per collar, depending on how many animals you have them on. And so it's a good consideration, especially for small ruminants. And then that cell communication can reduce maybe some of those base station fees that you pay there, but you really have to consider as well, do you have a good cellular connection within your pasture to enable that to be able to work effectively? Vents, as Joel talked about, was established in the United States. It was really, I think, the first commercially available virtual fence system within the United States. And so they've been implemented, to my knowledge, almost every single state in the Western United States has some kind of virtual fencing projects going on out there. And these are deployed over tens of thousands of animals. They are designed for cattle, so to my knowledge, they don't have small ruminant systems that are available with these. They do not have a mobile app that I'm aware of, that it's all through the computer and through a web interface, which you can access on your phone, but it can be kind of challenging that it's not specifically designed for that mobile application. And then, as Joel said, there are base station fees, communication as well, which is about $10,000 to $12,000. I believe the company recommends at least 2 base stations, but it does depend on the topography of your situation. But usually if you have 2 base stations, it's kind of a fail-safe. For example, if one base station goes down, you still have another available where you could still interact with and change management on those collars if need be. And then that collar cost is about $40 per year, plus that battery of $10, as Joel mentioned. And so with vents, you don't actually own the collars, you essentially lease them from the company, which can be a huge benefit if you do happen to lose a collar. We usually can email the company and they'll send replacement ones to us to be able to replace those if we're unable to find it. And as you can imagine, that's a significant advantage versus maybe if you have a $300 collar that you lose, you're essentially out that money on that collar. Halter, like I said, was established in New Zealand, and they initially developed these through dairy as well as beef systems. But again, these systems are really designed for cattle. Again, they have a computer as well as a mobile app, so you have that ability to control these things much better with your mobile phone if you're out there in the pasture. And then they have base stations as well that they're based off of. And those base stations are approximately $4,500. And then that collar cost is about $66 annually that you're going to pay for that system as well. And these systems also come with solar panels on them to be able to extend that battery life for those collars that are out there. And then East Shepherd, which is through Gallagher, which is a pretty well-known fencing company. A lot of folks that use polywire fence or electrical wire is probably well aware of Gallagher Company. Like I said, they started investing in this back in 2014, and within the past year or two, I would say they launched in the United States. And so these are commercially available in the United States if you're interested. Again, designed for cattle, not designed for small ruminants. They do have computer and mobile apps available. And then they have an option with these where you could either utilize a base station, which is about $5,000 for those base stations, or they also have the capability to be able to use cellular networks as well, which is kind of nice if you need that flexibility in your operation, or you know, you want to work with this company and you don't really want to pay for the base stations because you have good cellular network. Those options do exist with those. East Shepherd also, you purchase that collar, and so that collar cost is about $250. And then you have an annual subscription of about $18 to $24, depending on whether you're using the base station or the cellular network, to be able to get that information out and communicate with those collars out there in the pasture. And so when we look at these companies, and if you're interested in implementing these, I'd really encourage most producers to kind of talk to a variety of different companies and try and weigh which one is probably going to work best for your situation, right? Obviously, cost is a big thing that folks consider. And as Joel talked about, there are some opportunities becoming available to be able to cost share some of these. You know, that initial cost, depending on what company you utilize, you might have a higher cost in terms of base station up front, but that might be lower in terms of subscription fees that you're paying annually versus other companies. Maybe you have a lower upfront cost to be able to implement these, but maybe that subscription fee is higher. And so it's really worth penciling that out and not just factoring in kind of that initial sticker shock of, oh my gosh, here's 2 base stations and 300 collars, and this is going to cost, you know, $50,000 to be able to implement this in year one. I think we tend to focus a little bit on that initial cost of these systems, but maybe don't factor in, you know, okay, well, if I have $15,000 in annual fees, you know, over 3 or 5 years, how much is that going to cost me to implement this? And really factor and pencil that in to your decision-making process. Species, obviously, if you're interested in using these systems for small ruminants, no fence is likely your best bet. Communication, cellular base station, computers versus cellular apps are things to consider. How do you prefer to be able to use technology? And then battery versus solar is really a big consideration. That solar powered is nice because one, maybe you could do more intensive management where you're not going to wear that battery down if that animal is interacting with those virtual boundaries much more frequently, is something to consider. As well as your production system. You know, if you're not working your animals frequently, or if you need to, we've heard some producers that maybe they want to utilize a vent system with the battery, but they're not sure how it would work with their production system because they only bring in their animals maybe twice a year to work them. And they're not sure if that's going to align with that battery life with some of that. And then lastly, think about company support as well. When you're talking to these different companies and getting an idea of whether the pros and cons, what kind of support structure do they have to help you successfully implement virtual fence on your operation? Right? Is it easy to get you know, virtual fence? They have a whole network of Merck animal health specialists that you potentially could reach out to, and they could help troubleshoot issues that you have there. Or is there companies that maybe they don't offer as much support and you're someone on your own on that? And then think about time investment. I think when we talk about virtual fence, a lot of times we tend to think like, oh, we put a collar on, we manage the animal, and we save all this time and labor, but we don't always consider how much time and labor goes into actually getting these systems up and running, right? And so, for example, you know, you might look at collar construction, and maybe it's only 2 or 3 minutes per collar to be able to, you know, take the battery out, change it, put it back in, get the collar ready to be deployed. But if you multiply that by 300 animals, that might be, you know, 900 minutes potentially that you have to get collars ready. So that might be 2 or 3 days that you're spending getting these collars ready. There's also base station construction to consider. So that might be a day or two for that initial investment to get these things up and running. And then it's really important not to discount how long it takes to be able to learn the system and learn it effectively as well, right? You have to be able to put the time in to be able to map all of your pastures that you have, map your water locations within there, learn how to implement virtual fence boundaries on there. And so it's really important that I think once you get used to the system and you learn it, it becomes pretty easy and intuitive. But consider how familiar you are with technology and how quickly you're able to learn and adapt to new systems. And consider that into your planning purposes of, I might need to spend a week or two, or maybe it's going to take me 6 months to actually really get used to this system and be able to put that time investment to be able to make it work effectively. Other practical considerations, we talk about this a lot, is livestock handling facilities. It's really important. And no judgment, but I see a lot of these chutes and scales when I go out to ranches, especially my in-laws' place, where we have, handling chutes that are maybe from the 1970s, that do the job, generally speaking, but these are really not the kind of livestock handling facilities that you want if you're going to be collaring, a couple hundred animals while they're in that situation. And so one of the things, and I'll just hit this video, that we kind of talk about, especially if producers getting interested, is do you have access to a good hydraulic chute where you could actually keep these animals somewhat contained as you're putting these collars on these animals? And so here's a YouTube video that we put out that kind of discusses this a little bit. And you can see me putting a virtual vents collar on a cow. And this is kind of one of their older kind of pre-carabiner designs where we had these shipping container tags that were on there, but it's pretty much the same idea. And you can see, it only takes about, 20, 30 seconds really to collar an animal. So it's not that much time that they're in the chute during that process. But most of the animals, most of them are fairly calm, but a lot of them aren't as calm as some of these cows that we have going through here. And some of them might move around quite a bit. And these are things that could potentially pose hazards to people that are working animals. And so if your hands are in a position, or if you're leaning over an animal, you really need to be aware of where your body is in relation to that animal. How can they move quickly? And so you're not in a position that you get stuck. And really having a good chute to be able to put these on really helps the safety of both the animals and the people. Generally speaking, it's pretty quick and easy to put these collars on. When you release them from the chute, they act like bucking bulls probably for the first about 30 seconds, and then animals calm down, and we really don't see any behavior differences after that initial release from the chute. For practical considerations as well, you really need to rethink how you manage your operation. And again, turning that physical labor into cognitive labor and using that mental ability to be able to think about how could I manage this piece of property if I have that ability to put a fence anywhere. But also thinking about maybe you have to do things somewhat differently when you're implementing these, right? So we need to allow access to water. It's really easy to go into a computer software and click, 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 and not realize, oops, I just virtually fenced them out of the water source within that pasture, right? And so we've had that happen before, maybe with graduate students or interns sometimes, or let's set up a virtual boundary and you go look at it and say, hey, here's the water. You need to make sure they have access to that, or else you're going to have, very poor training on your animals, to say the least. You also have to consider things like GPS error when you're setting up some of these water sources. So here's another pasture we have here. And right here in the middle where there's no virtual boundary is where our water source is. And we typically give about a 50 to 100 meter buffer around that water source out in pasture. Just so as you have animals that are going into water, that you don't have kind of that initial GPS error, maybe that's 10 meters or so, that you're not accidentally encountering some of those virtual boundaries, which might potentially confuse animals, which is going to lead to less effective operations of your virtual fence system. Things like gates, we tend to not virtually fence where those gates are. Part of that is in the case of emergency, if we need to open a gate and move animals, we don't have to turn off a virtual fence boundary, but also so they don't learn that association of here's a gate, there's a virtual boundary on that thing, which normally we haven't had a problem with, but these are just generally things that we do when we're implementing these on our pastures. And then we need to know where these virtual boundaries are. It can be difficult because when you're out in the field, you can't see where these are. That's by definition, it's a virtual boundary, right? And so we really need to make sure we know where these boundaries are, as well as include your ranch, sorry, typo, help on there to be able to know where these virtual boundaries are. So if you have people that are doing things like feeding animals, if they're moving them, if they're treating animals, that they're well aware of where these virtual boundaries are. And so we had this situation once where our ranch manager didn't realize that we had a virtual boundary in this pasture. And so if your animals are contained here, right, and you feed hay out here, you can guess what's going to happen, right? Your animals are going to get zapped as they're starting to run through there to go for their hay, and you're going to have a little bit of a disaster on your hands in that situation. And so this wasn't too bad, but again, these are things that are practical to consider. How am I going to feed animals? Do I know where that virtual boundary is, so I'm not pulling them across that unsuccessfully? If I need to treat an animal, I can't just go out there and push them into the chute. And if I need to turn off that virtual boundary, and I need to allow enough time for that virtual boundary to turn off for that collar. And so as we talk about real time, we generally can see animals in real time, but it might take 3, 4, or 5 hours sometimes for that signal to get out to all those collars in a pasture to be able to turn off. And that's something to consider as we kind of rethink our management, that we can't go out there and just, round them up, move them on that day. We need to kind of plan ahead a little bit as we're implementing these. And then there's always kind of practical considerations, things like battery life, like I said, delays in communication. If you're placing these on growing animals like steers and heifers, you likely need to monitor those collars frequently just to make sure they're not getting too tight as those animals are growing. And so we usually adjust those maybe every month or two if they're on growing classes of animals. And then there's always going to be unforeseen issues that are happening. Like we had an animal we had a collar that we put on a little bit too loose, and he got his foot through there, that collar, between that collar and that animal's head. And so these are always things that are going to happen. You can never plan 100% when you're working with animals, how things are going to go. And really, it's just kind of a learning process just to be aware of as you go through this. There's a lot of practical applications for virtual fence, things like riparian management, excluding animals from streams or strategically grazing these areas without excessive concentration. We see a lot of this, especially in the western United States, but I know Missouri has a lot of miles of streams and rivers. So there's a lot of opportunities to improve some of those riparian areas. Targeted grazing. This is a producer in South Dakota that was utilizing goats for targeted grazing. He's actually implementing now virtual fence with the no fence system. It's basically identifying, if there's patches of thistle out in your pasture, we're going to concentrate our goats on those thistle patches and basically control some of that. I know a woman that was in Wisconsin that had a group that she called the Munch Bunch that essentially would provide custom weed control business using virtual fence. And so she would use goats that were well trained to the virtual fence system to go in there and manage weeds through municipalities or livestock producers as well. So there might be opportunities for some of those with small ruminants. Livestock crop integration. A lot of times our ag fields usually have poor fences. And so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, of this to integrate livestock into crops. We have a sheep producer here that's using virtual fence to integrate sheep into his crop fields. One of the things he kind of noticed for small ruminants is that they tend not to respond well to hard corners. And so you have 90-degree angles. He's kind of noticed that a lot of times sheep will kind of get trapped within those and get confused. And so he tends to round out his virtual fence boundaries to help kind of control some of those issues. But again, that's kind of part of the process of implementing things, observing how it works, and then learning and adjusting just to make it successful. Within the West, they've been utilizing it for things like fire breaks, to create fire breaks, as well as, a whole host of virtual fence opportunities for things like improving wildlife-friendly fences, as well as managing maybe more sensitive habitats for animals. And then lastly, I know in Missouri, there's not as much kind of issue of public lands grazing on Forest Service, but we're seeing a lot of federal agencies being interested in virtual fence to be able to help improve management on grazing allotments in the western United States. And then final slide here, because I know we're getting close to time. Some of the things that we get asked a lot are what are the impacts on production? And so there's been quite a few studies of virtual fence looking at stress responses in animals. And really, if you go through these, we see no real long-term impact of virtual fence systems on animal stress. And this has been studied multiple times. As well as at South Dakota State, we've also found looking at average daily gain or things like grazing behavior, we really see no difference in those metrics between virtual fence and control groups. And so we're pretty confident that it doesn't have a long-term impact on things like production of animals. And with that, as we move forward, I see more and more companies coming online, entering the marketplace. I likely see, Merck acquiring vents, that you're probably going to see some other metrics like illness detection, things like that being integrated into these virtual fence systems. And with that, hopefully we got time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very engaging. Thank you so much to Joel, Margaret, Kathleen. They've been helping to answer a lot of questions, and that's going to save us a lot of time. I'm going to turn over to Kathleen. She's our MU Virtual Fence Program Manager. Please tell us what you have to offer, and also please touch on the cost sharing with Missouri producers. Thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah, no problem. So yes, my name is Caitlin Dosler. I'm the Virtual Fence Program Manager with the Center for Regenerative Ag at Mizzou. And I just wanted to quickly tell all of you about our new virtual fence program at the center. So basically what we are doing, the goal for the project is to help increase regenerative grazing opportunities, specifically with cover crop grazing and different aspects like that to Missouri producers across the state. So what we've done is selected 5 producers from across Missouri, and we are going to provide them with virtual fence collars, and they are going to in turn become our farmer educators. So we're going to have field days, webinars, education events, all different kinds of things like that, where other producers can come to their properties, see how virtual fence works, talks to producers firsthand, and really learn and be able to see if virtual fence would be a good fit for their operation. So in my role as the program manager, I take phone calls daily from farmers talking about virtual fence and answering questions and getting them in contact with the different companies and stuff like that. And so if you would like to learn more about the virtual fence program, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and David also has it, so he'll send it out with kind of the post notes from the webinar and stuff like that. And I'd be happy to put you on my email list to get more information about virtual fence companies and our events and things like that. And yeah, help you answer any questions you might have here in the state about getting virtual fence on your operations. So thanks. Oh, the cost share.
The cost share, yes.
Yes. I do have good news on that front, on the NRCS side of things. I've been talking with state officials, and nothing's set in stone yet, so that might be why some local offices don't know as much about it. But they're making really good progress, and they're hoping by November, when it's time to start signing up for EQIP for 2026, they're hoping that they will be able to offer a virtual fence cost share program. It's in the plans, they're working on it, and it should be coming unless they hit any major roadblocks. But yes, so that is exciting news. It is coming from Missouri producers.
Excellent. Thank you. One question here, and I think he has some feedback. I'm going to ask Jamie, which fence company would you recommend for livestock guardian dogs? Would you say no fence system for livestock guardian dogs as well?
Which company would I recommend for livestock dogs, like sheep dogs?
Yes, livestock guardian dogs, yes.
I believe Halo is a company that manufactures like virtual collars for dogs as well. And so I don't know anybody that's tested that on sheepdogs per se, but I can see there being an application where maybe you could manage sheepdog to manage the sheep if they're well trained on that. But yeah,
I
I
use
don't
a
know.
Halo on my Great Pyrenees.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and it's worked really well for her. She hasn't even gotten a warning feedback in over a month now. She's learned her boundaries so well.
Hmm. Thank you, Belinda. Excellent. Thank you for that. Do it, Dr. Yu, I think there's one more coming. Okay, there's a link to the quick survey. Okay, please, there's a link to the quick survey. If you please want us to, if you want to please quickly fill that up, we're still going to send that to you via the email, and when we send the materials to you. We have Caitlin's email right there. And we want to thank you so much we want to thank the presenters today, Dr. Jamesy, Dr. Joe Yellick, thank you for your time and information. Caitlin, thank you so much for coming today to tell us what you do And then we're going to send all the materials to everyone present today. And we're going to take a follow-up questions. Of course, Caitlin is here with us at Missouri, of course, to help us take any follow-up questions on virtual fencing. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.